Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. Every week, we bring you the stories of people who, in one way or another, are improving the lives of others locally, globally, and digitally. It's part of the process, part and partner. You know what I mean. As part of Rotary International, 1.4 million Rotarians and Rotaractors around the world and 36,000 clubs. And we believe that regular doses of inspiration are the kinds of things that just kind of make life a little better. To that end, we have speaking to us today Rabbi Sanford Akselrad, who wrote a book, and that book was a book that came out of his experience leading his congregation in Nevada, the Congregation Ner Tamid. Sorry, and his regular essays have become something that are what we think to be a collection that everyone can benefit from, and that's exciting. So with that, Rabbi, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being part of our day-to-day, and welcome to the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you all virtually, and somehow we're all connected throughout the world as Rotarians or wannabe Rotarians, or, well, part of a family of Rotarians. I should, by way of introducing myself, mention that my father, of blessed memory, Sidney Akselrad, was a lifetime Rotarian, and carrying on that mantle is Lisa, my sister, who's on this. And she predicts somewhere in the future, perhaps when I retire, we'll have another Akselrad Rotarian. So you just never know. But the main thing is, I'm so proud of her legacy, my father's, and really the organization, which has done so much for so many people throughout the world. And in a way, that's a segue to this book, which is called Love in the Time of Corona. What I want you to do is think back in time. And it's funny how we have to now think back. It's like that period of time is something that perhaps we want to forget. But for us who live today, the time of COVID, or I called it the time of Corona, is our Great Depression. What my grandma used to talk about, and she'd talk about the 30s and the Great Depression. Then another generation might have talked about 9/11 or Vietnam. For us and the children that we are raising, or grandchildren, they're going to probably share memories of what happened during those couple years of COVID. So let's think back about what happened. It was 2019, and the first inklings of something that we didn't really have a name for appeared in China. It was December 31st, 2019, and there was what they thought was a case of pneumonia in Wuhan. And pretty much the virus spread over to many different countries, and the first American deaths occurred in February. On March 6, 2020, President Trump declared a national emergency. That was on March 13th, rather, and billions of dollars to fight this virus had been allocated. And by mid-April, the disaster just kind of spread throughout the country. By the end of it, we're still, in a sense, with COVID. We're learning to live with it. But for the bulk of it, the statistics are 1,127,000 people died, the most of any country. And from what I read, over 103.5 million confirmed cases of COVID have occurred. So this affected all of our lives. And we went into, if you remember, a period of great fear, ambiguity, consternation, not knowing what to do. And the book kind of sprung from that, because it was the middle of March when it started to affect Las Vegas. And someone on my board said, Rabbi, this thing has caused us to close our synagogue doors. We had to close our religious school. people are losing their jobs, the casinos are going to close. We're afraid. Could you please write an essay that might bring us a message of hope or inspiration? And my first thought was, well, what's an essay going to do? I mean, this thing is bigger than me, bigger than any of us. But I at first reluctantly said, I'll be happy to. And I wrote that first essay, which was called Love in the Time of Corona. And from that one essay came the inspiration to write a second, and then a third, and then a fourth. And before you know it, there was over 100 essays that were written over that 2-year period of COVID, which really was the intense period before the government and society at large said, enough already, we think it's time. And I address this in my book as well, where people decided it was safe to take off their masks or to open the casinos in Las Vegas and anywhere else you live that's more normal, your places of worship, your businesses, and things began to return to normal. It was tentative, depending upon where in the world you lived and how fierce the outbreaks were. Some people still were wearing masks and some weren't. So that was the context by which the book was written. So from one essay, it became over 100, and they all had that moniker in the time of Corona. I just thought it kind of defined this period of time in which we were living as something that was unique. And hopefully someone will read this book, 10 years from now or 50 years from now, and they'll look at it and they'll say, wow, I had forgotten that. We used to take our mail and we left it outside for 3 days. Oh yeah, we used to wipe down the mail. We were afraid to leave our homes, and all those fears. Well, they served as a source of inspiration for me to write these essays, to bring a message of hope, resiliency, and to help people travel from fear to faith, from darkness to light, from being strangers with one another to being supportive human beings of each other. And that's the constant theme that rings throughout the book. The essays by nature are about a page and a half. They're little mini slices of life, and they would just come to me. And at the end, there would always be, I hope, a little bit of a punchline of something that people would remember. The book, although written originally for a Jewish audience, my congregation, started being shared among many different people, many different friends. And before you know it, there were people who weren't necessarily the Jewish faith who found them interesting, fascinating, and inspirational as well, simply because, number one, perhaps they enjoyed learning a little bit about the Jewish faith, but overall, the message that I found was universal, something that everybody could relate to. I want to share with you a little bit of some of these essays. First, just the table of contents, if you will. Love in the time of Corona. Then I went to prayer in the time of Corona. Technology. Remember when we had to learn Zoom, right? Who knew what Zoom was? Then I keep going. I talk about loss in the time of Corona, in which I reflect upon as a rabbi having to do a funeral without anyone there because people were afraid to gather. So there might be 1 or 2 people. The rest of the folks were watching on Zoom. The same thing would occur, for example, when I would visit people in the hospital, could no longer do that. So the orientation of how I would do my job, all of a sudden, visiting someone in the hospital meant calling the hospital, speaking to the nurse at charge, then bringing out an iPad, putting it in front of the sick person, and then we would FaceTime. And that became a real thing for 2 years. I would touch upon Jewish holidays, and then I would do some things that were whimsical, walking the dog in the time of Corona, in which I reflected how, I got to get out of this house. So I'm going to walk the dog, and by the end of the essay, I conclude really the dog was walking me, getting me out of the house, getting me to know my neighbors. I talked about the war in Ukraine near the end of the essays, and I talked about what it meant to finally get COVID. There was a time, if you will recall, that, anytime you got a sniffle, all of a sudden you're afraid to be with that person because maybe they had it, and we didn't necessarily have the test kits yet. So the very fact that someone got sick made you fearful of them. And then finally, you might get it. And so the name of the essay was, tag you're it in the time of Corona, so to speak. So let me just read a little bit of one or two of the essays and see where it takes us. One of the things perhaps more contagious than a virus is fear. Sometimes fear is unwarranted, but what happens when it is warranted? What happens when we live in a time of anxiety and uncertainty and, yes, fear? First, we should acknowledge that to a degree, the fear response is a good thing. It protects us, it keeps us safe, it warns us when we are entering an unsafe environment or relationship or decision. So it's okay to be anxious and afraid, and to acknowledge that we live in uncertain times. It's okay. But, and isn't there always a but? It can also be overwhelming, which can lead to bad decisions, panic, a paralysis of the spirit and soul. So let's all take a deep breath. Yes, let's all breathe, meditate, hit the pause button, read a book, listen to music, watch a comedy, distract, embrace moments of calm. I'm not saying don't watch the news, but perhaps we should not obsess over it. I'm not saying don't change behavior to help suppress the virus, but, and isn't there always a but? Perhaps we should also change other behaviors, like look for opportunities of small acts of kindness, write a letter to a friend or a family member, a real honest to goodness letter, phone a friend or a loved one. Look for opportunities to catch up on all those things you have procrastinated around the home. Last thought for the moment. If we spend as much time trying to heal the world, clean the world, bring the world together as we have spent dividing the world these past few years, I think we will have learned a very important lesson. Stronger together is the only way we can beat this virus, and we will emerge stronger together. So with that opening essay, it sets the whole tone of my philosophy. Society then, unfortunately, as it still is now, was divided, and people were afraid. And fear makes bad decisions, but it also pulls people apart. One of my perhaps not so subtle observations was that in times of war, nations usually come together and they pull together. It may not be lasting, but during that time that they're fighting the war, they are one unit. But it didn't happen when the coronavirus hit us. We still remained divided as a society as things progressed. There were conspiracy theories. There were people who wanted to mask and some who didn't. There were people who were taking the vaccine and thought it was unbelievable. And there were others who either thought it was a conspiracy or they were mistrustful. So every step of the way, I was trying to preach hope, community, not being afraid, but acknowledging anxiety and recognizing the uncomfortableness of what it means to live in a time of great ambiguity. Those were the constants throughout all the essays, but from different vantage points, depending upon the source of my inspiration. As a child, I loved to play the game of tag. The anticipation of finding someone and chasing them to pass it along with a mere tap on the shoulder and a shout, "Tag, you're it." It occurred to me that this virus is a bit like that game, wondering who gets tagged and who gets a pass. Well, this past week, I got tagged. So this was in October of 2020 when I got the virus. I felt the symptoms coming on Saturday afternoon and went in as soon as possible for a rapid test and tested positive, again, before there were home tests. And then I go on to say who I was grateful because I had a lot of obligations as a rabbi, and I had to just stop everything and get coverage for weddings and funerals and the whole bit. But life doesn't always happen at our convenience. Car battery dies at just the wrong time. Is there ever a right time? I remember when my kids were younger and my wife and I were set to go out for the evening, inevitably someone would come down with a cold or flu. It's almost as if getting touched by these inconvenient but serious events are like winning a celestial lotto. And all I could think of was, if I had to win a lotto, why did I win this one? Maybe God didn't hear me quite right. I didn't want to win the COVID lotto, but the lotto. When we are tagged with unfortunate results, it is easy to get down. Keeping a sense of humor has always kept me in good stead and given me perspective. It's not just that it could always be worse. It's realizing that there is indeed more than one way of getting touched by life. Sometimes the touch hurts, and sometimes it is a love tap. Both can remind us of our vulnerability and how easy it is to take things for granted. And two, as more people learn that I had contracted COVID, I realized I did win the lotto. People sent me texts, calls, emails, offers to help, or just to say they cared. As a person who is in the caring business by profession, it isn't easy to accept help or to have folks fuss over me. After all, that's my job. But I do appreciate everyone's concern. I will be in quarantine until the middle of the month, each day a bit stronger. The friendship lotto has given me an abundance of riches. Tag, I'm it. I look back at these essays, and even though I'm the one who wrote them, sometimes, since they just seem to come like this, it's not that I remember when I wrote them for the most part, but I remember the feelings and emotions, and they still stir with me, of what it meant to be vulnerable and accept help from others, what it meant to transform a synagogue, just as many people who are watching this had to figure out a way to transform their businesses and to figure out creative ways to do the same thing and make yourself relevant, helpful, and healing. A synagogue or a church or a mosque is by very nature supposed to be a resource, a home of solace and support. And we did not miss a beat, but it was not easy. Very first week, we had to figure out how to live stream our services. Thankfully for me, I have a much younger colleague in her 30s, and she was able to figure out the technology until, the world caught up, and now there are live streaming services, and you can pay for that, and they take care of all the behind the scenes type of things. But all of a sudden, I was talking to a camera about 5 feet away from me to an empty sanctuary. And that is a humbling experience, if you will. And that went on for a good 2 years. That was just one example. The other was opening our Sunday school, and the teachers had to teach by Zoom, and that went on, of course, in the secular world. And then we had life cycle events. And again, some people, when they could postpone, chose to postpone, like a bar mitzvah or a wedding. But other things like a death can't be postponed. And we had to find creative ways to make sure that there was meaning and support for families in their time of need. Ultimately, the congregation, of course, survived, and I would say we even thrived. We became closer and supportive. A lot of people wondered what would happen, but what happened was people stayed with us, and they stayed together as a community. And I think that in itself is very telling. And we shouldn't have to wait till times are tough for us to be a community and to understand the importance of a community. But by golly, sometimes it does take tough times, whether it's a virus or more recently we had, the Hurricane Hillary, and we had fires in Maui, and just all kinds of horrendous things that keep happening as climate change impacts us. And we realize that we are stronger together, that we are better off when our neighbors are our friends, that we are better when we understand what it means to be resilient and to fight against the feelings of sadness and loneliness and cope by feeling a strength from within. And if one is so inclined, their faith and their faith tradition. But I think there's also a belief in faith in your fellow human beings. I saw a lot of good things happen during the time of Corona where people stepped up and they helped one another. And these essays are a reflection of that, and hopefully will serve as a source of inspiration and strength to everyone who reads it. So thank you so much for listening, and hopefully I didn't go over my 12 minutes, and maybe it's time for a few questions.
All good. And I'm very much into our getting to some of the questions, and I want to introduce the others on the call. My name is Rushton. I am the programs chair for the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, and I was its first president. We have with us two other members of the team, Lisa, who is here in the Bay Area, Rory, who is in Houston, longtime friend of the club, Heather Edwards of the Rotary Club of Eugene Metropolitan, and a buddy of mine in the Rotary programs space. So, Heather, I'm going to have you unmute and ask the first question. And Rabbi, we're excited to jump into this with you.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Rushton, and thank you, Rabbi, so much for being here. I wish I could time travel your book so I could read it back when we didn't know how long this was going to go on. I can't imagine. I think that was one of the scariest things, is we just didn't know. Is this 2 weeks, 2 months? Is this forever? So one of the great frustrations that I saw was, and I'm sure you saw this as well, is all of the anti-science among the religious communities. And I'm a Catholic, but not one who can quote the Bible. So I was doing a lot of research, and I just felt like there's a biblical imperative here to get vaccinated, to protect our fellow people, right? So I did a bunch of reading and found all these verses and tried to write the most compelling argument I could to say, you know, this is being your brother's keeper, right? So I'm wondering if Judaism has that in your tradition as well, that there is something that compels you to do something for the rest of these, right?
So there is in Judaism. So, but before I express what Judaism, anytime there's a national disaster of some kind, there can be more fundamentalist religions who take that disaster as a punishment by God. If you look back not too long ago when AIDS struck,
Yeah.
all of a sudden that was a punishment by God for people who, were part of the LGBT community. So you can always take something that is horrific and you can put that on God as God striking down and punishing us. And they use that as a way to try to change behavior as that pastor sees fit. And of course, all that it does is make people feel distant from God, because who wants to believe in a loving God if God's the one who creates, war and famine and AIDS and COVID and all that, instead of understanding what our responsibility is to care for our fellow human beings. So in Judaism, we have a concept called pikuach nefesh, and that is the saving of a life is greater than all of our commandments. So traditionally, there's what we call a mitzvah. Some people loosely translate it as a good deed. The plural is mitzvot. And there's 613 of them. And to make it more compact, the idea is that for saving a life, you can violate all of those. So, for example, pretend a doctor was observant, very Orthodox Jew, and he was needed in order to save someone's life. He would violate the laws of the Sabbath. He would have to drive. Now, he may not violate all of them. He'd try to minimize it, but he would do whatever he had to do or she would have to do in order to save that life. So from the Jewish perspective, the vaccine was pikuach nefesh, but also when we didn't know the impact of the virus and we had to decide, for example, not only to shut off our weekly services, but what were we going to do for the high holidays? And I remember distinctly in June, remember it started in March, in June, my synagogue president saying, oh, by September, this thing's going to be over. I said, I don't think so. We got to prepare ourselves. He said, you really think so? I said, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but it's going to take time to be prepared. And so we actually ended up filming the service with no one in front of us, and then producing a broadcast to everyone in the congregation of a produced service. But to answer your question again, the saving of life is fundamentally the highest value in Judaism.
That's really beautiful. Thank you.
Get one more question in before we stop the recording. The role of a pastor, you've been with your congregation for 35 years, if I read the bio properly.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
35 years.
That's no short tenure. And over that time, and probably specifically in a time of challenge like the time of Corona, I think any teacher or any pastor learns as much from students and congregants as they might from their own study and experiences. Is there an experience from that came from one of your congregants that informed, say, an essay that taught you something particularly special about how you see the world as a part of taking on the role of a writer?
I think when we realized what was going on with Corona and the isolation that people would feel, people stepped forward. One of the great ideas was the phone tree. And what we did is we just took the entire community and we took volunteers, and there was maybe 20, 25 volunteers. And we took the alphabet, and each one was assigned, you're A through C, you're D through, and I want you to call those families every week, unless the family says it's okay, we don't want any more calls. But even when people had family, you'd be surprised how many people were just in isolation and they just wanted to hear a friendly voice. We're so used to texting or Facebook or social media. People long to see an actual human being, and they actually long to hear a voice. And so this caring community that sprung was a source of inspiration. And then there was another one that literally was bringing groceries to people's homes, and especially when we found out that they had COVID, and they would bring groceries to their home. So people came forward to me with ideas on how they might help. I remember another big one was creating masks. Everyone, who could sew, all of a sudden wanted to sew the masks. Now we learned later on, although it was a very nice idea, those masks were totally ineffective, and you needed those specialty masks, which make it very hard to breathe, especially when you have a cold. But the idea was, let's just wear masks, and people were making these right and left. The point was, even as we were divided, as I pointed out, there was nevertheless amongst many people a pulling together. And I think that sense of resiliency was so important. The discounting of science and the conspiracy theories and all that really did a terrible disservice to our nation, and was really unlike, in my opinion, other national disasters and that have fallen. But what was similar was fear. So if you look at other plagues, fear always was a part of it. And sometimes they would look for scapegoats, and they might point to certain people. In Jewish history, we were subject to that with the bubonic plague, for example. So fear is what I was preaching against, and fear also became as dangerous as the virus itself. And so that was part of what drove the division, and not to good purpose.
All right. Well, we'll wind down the recording, but as we always like to do, we hand it back to our speaker for the final word, which I'll do in just a moment. All of you who are joining us, thank you for spending some of your time with the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. We hope that you enjoy the messages that you hear, that you find the hundreds of recordings that we have to be inspirational to you in some fashion, and that you will share with others what you learn about our club. If you are a visiting Rotarian, let us know you were here. There is an attendance form just down the page at Rotary at SiliconValleyRotary.com, where our meetings are, and you can put in your email address properly and get an automated email back that you can pass along to your club secretary to make up a miss if you are working to do that. At the bottom of our page, there is our forum, and we ask that you leave comments about what you learned in this program or any of the other elements of the meeting. With that, I'd like to pass it back to Rabbi and just say thank you again for taking your time to speak to us. And what would you like for people to have clearly in mind as they finish the video?
So I'll put up the book so they can see it. It's available on Amazon. It's called Love in the Time of Corona. And my last name is very unusual, Akselrad, Akselrad. And I hope that you find the book and you find it meaningful. So as a final thought, my motto has become stronger together. And as I've alluded to several times, it was a motto because I felt our country was so divided. But it's a good motto for life. We don't have to live alone. We don't have to be the best or the only one who can do something. We're actually stronger when we're able to ask for help or assistance or work together to create something that is bigger than ourselves, just like Rotary. A Rotary club of one person might be able to do some good, but a Rotary club with over 1 million members throughout the world does a lot of good. So if living the time of Corona has taught us anything, it's about having a faith that can bring us together and a love that reminds us of the commonality of our own humanity. The virus didn't ask whether you were Jewish or Buddhist or Muslim or Christian, didn't ask whether you were black or white or any other type of race or religion. It just found you, and you were it. So let's tag each other, but not with fear, but with hope, not with hate, but with love. But let's find each other and hold each other very tight. And that's how we're going to solve the world's problems. And we'll move forward together, stronger together. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Rabbi. And everyone, we will see you next week.